I'd like to welcome all of you to this great webinar on launch of a new book from Columbia University Press on soft power internationalism. Welcome to the call. My name is Tom Trebot. I am the director of Columbia University's Global Center in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And a lot of the impetus for the book and organization of the book really revolves around the Columbia Global Centers around the world, as well as our very distinguished faculty at Columbia and faculty associates from other universities. There are 3 global centers from Columbia's worldwide network who are joining with me this morning and have listeners of their own listening in. They include our office in Istanbul under Director İpek Çemtaha, and in Beijing under Director Helena Chow. So welcome to all of you on behalf of the 3 of us, the organizers of the Global Centers, and to all the people joining in from around the world. And while I'm on that point, for those of you so inclined, there's a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. I'm certain you're familiar with it from all the Zoom calls you've been doing, but if you'd like to use these first moments to introduce yourselves to the panelists on the Q&A, and maybe tell them where you're calling in from, that's always a nice way to sort of break the cyberspace ice, so to speak. So please feel free to use that Q&A now, and then during the course of our event to put in your questions and your comments that we can hopefully get to by the time our formal program is over. I'm also putting in the link, Malou, I'll ask you to do that, putting in the Q&A a link to the book publication page. So you can see this book from Columbia University Press and how to order it, either hard copy or as an ebook. And I encourage you, obviously, all to do so. Now, let's get on to the discussion of this very important book, Soft Power Internationalism, as our authors and editors tell us, is a global comparative history. This book is a global comparative history of how soft power came to define the period of time between the celebration of global capitalism in the 1990s, it seems like a long time ago, and the recent resurgence of nationalism and authoritarianism in different parts of the world. The book is edited by Professors Victoria de Grazia and Burcu Baykurt, both of whom are joining us today and will take over the narrative in just a moment. And the book brings together wonderful case studies from the European Union, all samples of soft power projection, the European Union, China, Brazil, Turkey, and of course the United States. Examining, the authors do, the genealogy of soft power in the Euro-Atlantic area and its evolution in the hands of other states seeking to counter US hegemony by non-militaristic means. So the book is a critical history of soft power as an intellectual project as well as a diplomatic practice. It provided me, and I'm sure all of us, with new perspectives on the potential and limits of a multilateral liberal global order. The events in Ukraine have made us ponder long and hard that key takeaway from the book. The book offers us all new ways in which to understand the conflict of Ukraine in a new light, in my judgment. We'll see what the authors and editors think. It also causes us to ponder the stability of a multipolar world in which liberal democracies vie for regional and global hegemony with illiberal authoritarian state models. So that's a lot to cover. It's a wonderful book. And I want to now step out of the way and welcome. We have our lineup of speakers, the authors who will tell you in their own words what the book was about and maybe what it helps us to understand about now and the future. So I'll just mention who they are, and Vicky and Burcu can add more to their introductions if they feel it's appropriate. But besides Professors De Grazia and Baykurt, we have a number of the chapter authors with us this morning, or this afternoon, or this evening. Professor Jack Snyder is a Belfer Professor of International Relations at Columbia University, who will provide, upon being called by Vicky, he'll provide keynote remarks. Professor Dilek Barlas, a professor of history at Koç University in Istanbul, will present highlights of the Turkish experience with soft power. Fernando Santamauro of United Cities and Local Governments, an NGO in Barcelona, Spain, but formerly of the University of Brasilia here in Brazil, will discuss the very interesting South-South diplomacy of his native Brazil. And then finally, Zongying Pan, for a distinguished professor of international relations at the Ocean University of China in Qingdao, will talk to us about the Chinese case. There's a lot to go through, I know, but fasten your seatbelts, get ready, and use that Q&A function, please, now, and then especially we'll come to that in the final 15 minutes of our time with you this morning. Vicky and Burcu, I turn it over to you and welcome you once again to the webinar. Thank you.
Okay, our agreement would be that I would, maybe because of my seniority, would open this. I had originally taken the initiative on this project. It coincided very much with the globalization of Columbia University, which one formed, taking the establishment of these global centers. And this became then a kind of vehicle for enabling thinking outside, if you want, of the province, which is in this case, the United States of America. So I deeply want to thank you, Tom, but also the other heads of centers in Istanbul, also in Beijing, for the hospitality which allowed us to get together. Okay, let me begin just with a little. Could I share a screen? Is that possible? Could you enable me that, Tom?
Malou, can you enable Vicky to share screen?
Thank you. Just it's a little.
Okay. Now you can, Vicky.
Okay, thank you. It's just something didactic here. Okay, if I can find it now, didacticism. All right. Okay, slideshow. All right. So this is a project which, in its initial glimmer, okay, before it became formalized into a more respectable search project, began with a kind of glimmer or a sort of movement of irritation on my part as an historian who had worked on sort of cultural, technological, social inventions aspects of American hegemony with respect to Europe over the 18th century, 20th century, ending roughly in the 1980s, 1990s. So I was quite struck in the course of the 1990s to see, a new round of innovation when I, of course, being a historian, had predicted a kind of decline. In particular, I was intrigued by this word, which was just beginning to circulate, soft power. So what I did is I asked myself, well, what is this, just another of these great social inventions like Hollywood or mass retailing, or is it something about American domestic politics and foreign relations, which is being used to kind of rekindle the buzz in American hegemony, but which would not bear really on American foreign policy strategy, and would not indeed cover it up for the lack, let's say, of large-scale domestic reforms. In other words, were we dealing with a sort of the smiley face of this new American globalism, neoliberalism coming out of the 1990s? And when I went to it, I found actually it was very, very, very interesting, because looking at it then, this was now by around 2005, 2010, I was astonished, as you can see from this Ngram viewer, at the diffusion of the term globally. In other words, it was being picked up all over, as the Ngram very roughly showed. And I was just very, very curious then, both as a historian, as a citizen, as a person very deeply invested in a peaceful global and equitable global order, as to what this intended. So what we did is gradually, with colleagues, both at Columbia and then more and more sort of developing a network abroad, is set up a group because we really needed to understand what this meant outside of the West, which has this great power to develop concepts and sort of occlude what their big sense is, and then to begin to sort of parasitize then the meanings as they evolve and globalize. So in effect, what we're very interested in doing is deprovincializing, that is moving outside of the West, where the terms soft power, normative power were being bandied around, and to understand how they were being used and appropriated by leading states in terms of regional and global concerns. We were very pragmatic as how we chose people to collaborate with, like minds we found in the end, which was quite wonderful. This opportunity to get glimpses of one another is very, very, makes me very, very happy. We were very interested in how these concepts and practices changed with appropriation and experimentation by regional, these powers that we chose, Republic of Turkey, the People's Republic of China, and Republic of Brazil, and we wanted to understand, how are they making sense of these terms, mainly in the governmental arena, because we had to, to focus. And then finally, we were asked, how did this period of experimentation reflect on visions of constituting international order, roughly in the period 1990 to 2015? Okay, this is some of our main findings. I have to say main findings because we were all working very differently in terms of our, if you want, our backgrounds, our disciplines, and be trying to find a language to speak with one another. It was a combination of history and other social sciences, and as a historian, but also because of the great diversity amongst us, it seemed very profitable to work without any very rigid kind of social scientific paradigms. Indeed, respecting that our different disciplinary cultures also differ because of the university and academic and intellectual structures in which we work. Well, the upshot was, one, that clearly the period from the 90s is an extraordinary period of development of international organization, with the internet as very much part of that. And so we could speak of what was predicted then in the 90s of a very intense international civil society, and that this sort of a very intense civil society, global civil society, with all of its linkages, did lend itself to the adoption of practices which seemed to suggest very optimistically that you could have new kinds of ways of addressing major problems internationally, and in any case, then impressed very much on major leading states that they're going to have to use this as a power to be used by the state in its own interest, or power to be deflected if it was felt that it was being used in the interest of another power. Okay, so this was very, very important. And I think Burcu particularly will follow up with some reflections on the internet as an important means of communication within this overriding thinking about the nature of soft power. The second was that there was war out there. I mean, this particularly was coming out of my own work, that the background of this is global warfare. That is, it is the war on terrorism. And we could never forget that that was behind it, a war as a kind of accelerant war, which then meant countries were very attuned to rebalancing, even if they weren't speaking to how to end that war. Okay, and that was a question that maybe we will come back to, since out and out warfare, not by the United States, but rather by Russia, which was already, as Jack Snyder will speak to was showing itself as a kind of the illiberal, very dangerous edge of our discussions about soft power. Third, commodity boom. Again, it was quickly forgotten in the wake of 2008, but that was a big incentive to states which formerly had not been able to spend a great deal on foreign relations. Turkey, notably, this was true also of Brazil. The commodity booms gave them balances that enabled them to piggyback on growing commerce and trade. And this was a big help to very sort of expansive thinking about what one could do with soft power in some neighboring regions. This is something that we'll come back to, I'm sure, especially in the Turkish and the Brazilian cases. Okay, that, if you want, on the expansive side. And then there was the sort of the turning in which we all caught on to, throughout 2010, things begin to turn like an eclipse, and certainly the world economic crisis, a big blow, the accompanying turn toward authoritarian populism, which changed the nature, not necessarily the spending, and that's something that would have to be explored more on soft power projects and practices. At the same time, the soft power in the United States and the speaking about soft power became more and more sharp. Some began to speak of the weaponization of soft power by the United States in the forms of the use of more and more of sanctions. This even, under a White House that identified with Barack Obama and the tenure of Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State. And finally, and this was picked up by Tomas Diaz, that there was mention of the Ukraine. It was certainly on our minds, at least in the case of those who are working in the European area, but not only in the European area, that the Ukraine was becoming a kind of a test case. So that is it's not presented in that way, but where the question of who's got the force and who's got the soft power, that was an open question, and it was posing real problems for the European Union, which hitherto had been speaking wholly in terms of largely in terms of a normative power, I should say, with attention given certainly to what kind of strategic power would be going along with that. But what it did suggest in the end was a kind of disillusioning about what the soft power meant, and ultimately that clearly it was the face, another effort, a very huge experiment, one that involved a lot of very, if you want, creative thinking, even optimistic thinking about the rebalancing of the international order in the wake of the 1990s and the effort to create new kinds of, if you want, stability and institutional order. Okay, let me turn that over now to Burcu and to provide yet another brief introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, Vicky. I just want to quickly echo Vicky in thanking all the past and present staff of Columbia Global Centers. This project would not have been possible without your tremendous help. I also want to thank our authors who are on this call, but also who cannot be with us today. And I want to keep it really short so that you get to speak more about your own contributions. So as Vicky nicely summed up, we try to look at soft power beyond the term itself and to try to understand what kind of a world order it made possible. And the internet as a communicative tool, mechanism played a crucial role in that. I think in the book we offer two sort of big conceptual contributions. One is to see the internet beyond its sort of broadcast function, to look at it as a critical infrastructure and a transnational market, which allows us to demonstrate that the sort of soft power battles that we're that we were seeing in other fields were also happening over the governance of this space, both in terms of starting in the 90s, the US making dedicated investment in in this infrastructure in other countries, as well as through its foreign policy communication channels to really sort of softly own that space, both through Silicon Valley companies, government spending, and the kind of trying to marry itself to that global civil society narrative. But in line with the sort of historical trajectory that Vicky sort of documented, we see the country is both we selected for this book, but even beyond that, like really pushing back against that dominance, especially starting in sort of mid 2000s, 2010s, and really sort of creating a counter, both narrative, but also a counter politics to US dominance in this space. Secondly, I think looking at the internet as this communication infrastructure allows us to really sort of challenge that binary within soft power as like the soft and hard. And just like war has always been part of, war making has always been part of the soft power toolkit, if you will, we see that those sort of binaries were really embedded within both the governance and the sort of investment in the internet as a critical infrastructure. Many of the tools that we consider to be the soft power products or soft products of Silicon Valley always depended on ongoing military funding, which not surprisingly ramped up post 9/11. We see during the Obama administration and onwards how the State Department brought many tech executives in rebuilding Afghanistan or Iraq, while also running a massive surveillance intelligence infrastructure. And I think most recently we see a similar, but a counter dynamic playing out in the way that like disinformation, misinformation narratives are circulating on social media, where different countries are sort of weaponizing their soft communication to push back against each other's narratives. So all of that is to say, I think historically, as well as conceptually, we found a lot of similarities and overlaps between the history of soft power and soft power internationalism and the history of the global internet as we knew it up until recently. And we kind of like end the histories at a similar point where the sort of optimistic 90s narrative really evolves into something else as we come to the 2015 time period that we sort of roughly ended our history. So let me end it there and turn it over to our authors to speak about their own chapters. But and I don't know, Jack, I think you're going first, right?
Yes.
Thank you, Burcu. Yes, I'm up next. So Joe and I defined soft power as the power to get others to want what you want them to want. And he did have this binary definition of hard power, which included for him military power as well as economic power. And he opposed it to soft power, which had this focus on the ability to get others to evolve their preferences in ways that were favorable to your own interests. And Nye thought that the United States of America was the country that had the most soft power, not only because of Hollywood, but because of all the other things that Vicky and Burcu mentioned. We should remember that looking back to the early 2000s, it really seemed like a period of time when decentering of soft power was actually on the upswing. The the BRICS countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and then maybe expansively including that with Turkey, were on the upswing, it seemed, with respect to their soft power, partly as a consequence of the bubble economy of neoliberal America, which, as Vicky pointed out, gave them a kind of economic opportunity to also develop their soft power muscles. And so this included Lula's Brazil, which looked for a time like it was going to be a model social welfare state for middle-income countries. And piggybacking on that prestige, Brazil put itself forward as a potential mediator for conflicts as far afield as the Middle East. China, in that period of time, was in its era of peaceful rise. When people did popularity surveys of countries, it was Germany and the People's Republic of China that routinely clocked in as the most popular countries in the world, not the United States, which was, in the midst of shameful behavior of foreign interventions that were going badly. Whereas China seemed to be putting forth a credible alternative model of modernity based on bureaucratic rationalization and effective technocracy. Turkey, under Erdogan in that first decade, was having tremendous successes with economic liberalization, and for a while looked like a credible candidate for a closer relationship with the European Union, while also drawing on its indigenous cultural themes and traditions, politicizing the pious segments of Turkish public in central Anatolia, parts of the country that traditionally had been left behind by previous Turkish regimes, and symbolizing their soft power with the idea of some kind of revival of Ottomanism. India at this time was growing at 7% and had, become a democratic country a bit more solidly, but also at the same time had emphasized traditional religious and cultural anchors of its political culture. Russia, compared to the chaos of the Yeltsin 1990s, surfing on the advantage of the uptick in oil prices, Putin put together a narrative about traditional values that resonated, even in, countries of the advanced European democracies and in parts of American public opinion. So the early 2000s started out as a period of high credibility that soft power was in fact decentralizing in these various ways. But I think that it's fair to say that this has collapsed just about everywhere in all of the countries that I just mentioned. We now have not Lula, but Bolsonaro. Maybe Lula is coming back, but he's not back yet. Modi has presided over economic setbacks, and his response to that has been to double down on religious discrimination and allowing hate speech and incitement and oppression of the Muslim minority. The People's Republic of China has had fraught relations with its minorities, including Hong Kong. It is roundly criticized for having a surveillance state and one-man rule. And arguably, the PRC's soft power has sunk so low as a result of this that they even get criticized for things that they seem to be doing wrong, but really aren't. There's a whole discourse about PRC's debt for equity, debt trap diplomacy towards the places where it builds infrastructure, like the port in Sri Lanka, as if China has kind of masterminded this as a way to like buy up property throughout Asia. And the actual research by credible Western scholars really minimizes this point. And yet, because China's soft power is under a cloud of suspicion, China gets blamed for bad stuff that it's not even really intending to do in a systematic way. Putin is, of course, a global pariah now. No soft power in Moscow these days. Erdogan has bankrupted Turkey and like some of the other strongman leaders, has doubled down on autocratization and discrimination against minority groups in his society as a way out of the corner that he's painted himself in. So all these places have plummeting soft power. This soft power collapsed either with declining economic power in a number of these countries, or because these countries are now looked at as anathema as a result of their military aggression or human rights violations. Their productive soft power gambits have, in essentially every case, devolved into self-defeating appeals to illiberal traditions, militant, belligerent nationalism, and arbitrary authoritarian rule. So why is this happening? Why did decentering power look promising briefly, but then take this very bad turn in all these places? So one thing to keep in mind is the authoritarian baseline. Liberal democracies with advanced economies have sustained what's called the democratic peace. No war ever between any two democracies, as long as you define democracy and war reasonably strictly. Whereas there's never in history been a comparable authoritarian peace. Authoritarian regimes historically, especially these kinds of major powers that I've been talking about, have traditionally had huge decision-making failures as a result of personalistic strongman rule. There's a lot of research on this now in my field of political science. And they use governance strategies that are based on repression, patronage, and corruption, which can work for a while, but generally tend to run out of gas. One of the things that I think is particularly relevant with the soft power states that I've been talking about is that all of them suffered when they hit what's called the middle income trap. So research on economic development and its political institutional underpinnings shows that for countries whose gross domestic product per capita is below 1/4 of the US GDP per capita level, can sustain economic growth at high rates if they are below that GDP per capita level. They have advantages of cheap labor. They need to mobilize underutilized resources, and often having a kind of authoritarian regime, like think of the Soviet first 5-year plan, is compatible with that first burst of industrial or economic development. The problem is that once they hit middle income above 1/4 US GDP per capita, then all the research shows that it's necessary to undertake institutional reforms and move in the direction of rule of law, equal opportunity before the law, accountable government to the people that's institutionalized in some constitutional democratic way. And in fact, the data show that unless you institutionalize pretty much the full panoply of civic and human rights, you get stuck in the middle income trap, because authoritarian, patronage-based, corrupt regimes don't grow once they get to that stage of economic development. And what those kinds of regimes tend to do when they hit the wall of the middle income trap is, well, they could either reform and succeed in becoming wealthy, like Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan did, or they can double down on nationalism and patronage-based economies, thinking that if they just stick to the old tried and true methods that got them through their first burst of economic development, that if they stick with that, they will continue on a growth trajectory. But that's not right, according to all the historical data that we have. The only exceptions to the middle income trap rule I've been talking about are Singapore and small oil producing monarchical states. So meanwhile, what's been going on in the liberal states whose soft power seemed to be collapsing with the rise of right-wing populism, the popularity of Putinism in Europe, the popularity of Trump and Brexit? What happened to that? Well, you know, we'll see how that turns out, but at the current moment, almost all of the important liberal democratic traditional powers, their governments are, you know, run by centrist or left center or right center regimes. It's too early to say whether the United States of America has stabilized its politics in this way, but it's pretty clear that we've bounced back from where we were in, say, 2017. At least at the moment. So if you were going to survey the world at this current moment, you would say that the decentering soft power push has collapsed, and the traditional sources of liberal democratic soft power are at least rallying their forces at the moment. Thank you.
Yes, I guess Nobody else is moderating this.
Oh, okay, I'd be glad to do so.
Go, Tom. Go on.
You're
Tom.
muted.
Right, Tom, you're muted now. There you go.
Okay, now it's better. Thank you very, very much, Jack, Professor Snyder. That overview, lots of issues to follow up on, and luckily we have people lined up to do that. Some of the follow up. We're going to turn first to consider the case of Turkey, and welcome Dilek Barlas, who joins us from Istanbul today. Dilek, we're it's going to be kind of a fast a round of country studies, but it's important that we hear from the different regional hegemons or would-be hegemons. And we'll start with Turkey. Dilek, welcome.
Okay, thank you. You all welcome. I'm not going to go in detail, of course, because it's already in the book what soft power is, how it was defined by Nye in his book. But what I would like to say here, and in fact, what we try to say with Lerna in this chapter of the book, that the terms similar to soft power were already used in Turkey. But what is interesting also, just after the military coup of 1980, neo-Ottomanism as a term was used by David Baykurt, who was a British journalist in his book, and later on by Graham Fuller, and after the collapse of the Soviet Union, again referring to a neo-Ottomanism in Turkey. In a sense, like they wanted to attribute a role to Turkey to play in the region after the collapse, of the Soviet Union. In Turkey, we will see that this neo-Ottomanism, even it wasn't used openly, but it was referred. But for example, in the mid-1990s, Demirel, the president of the time, used the term Turkish model, okay? And of course, it was the time after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and was attributing the role to Turkey as a democratic, secular Muslim country to be a model, for the countries in the Middle East, in the Turkic Republic, the old Soviet Turkic Republic, etc. Then in the 1990s, in fact, institutions also were established, such as TİKA, which is the Turkish Cooperation and Development Agency, to put into application this kind of role. Then what happened in the 2000s at the time of the JDP? When JDP came to power, they were referring to the terms such as neo-Ottomanism and Turkish model, but now they start, of course, referring to the soft power, which was also, used by Nye in his book. And for example, Davutoğlu, who was the foreign minister at the time, criticized the previous Turkish leaders not to make use of the history and geography of Turkey to be a global power. They, in fact, not only Davutoğlu, others also, such as Gül, they referred to the glorious time of the Ottoman Empire, and also highlighting the empire's Islamic tone, and attributing a role to Turkey. The term Turkish model came back again in the 2000 at the time of the GDP, but first immediately after 9/11, then during the electoral, in fact, victory of the JDP, and also during the Arab uprising in 2010. In fact, during the same year, JDP government established the Office of Public Diplomacy to initiate a new diplomacy with the aim of telling the story of new Turkey to wide-ranging audience, in fact, across the globe. Then Ibrahim Kalın, the spokesperson of the president, in fact, he said that Turkey's soft power capacity comes from its history, culture, and geography. Rather than seeing them as obstacle, the Turks now turning them into strategic assets, both at the domestic and foreign level. Then we can say that in the 1990s, Turkey's soft power was the manifestation of Turkey to prove itself at the international system. However, at the time of the JDP government, it was used to make Turkey a global power, pursuing Turkey's, very own national interest at the international level. And also, at the time, they started giving financial aid to some Middle Eastern and African countries. But after the mid-2010s, mainly after the Syrian war, now the Turkish officials were referring less to soft power, and they were saying that without hard power, there can be no soft power. In fact, this was also the case, I think, in the United States, not only in Turkey. This is like the general, outlines. Please, if you have questions later on, go on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dilek. I'm sure there will be questions and issues.
Sure.
Thank you for that very succinct overview
Okay.
of Turkey. We're going to turn now to Fernando Satomoru. As I said, joins us from Barcelona today, but he's based in Brazil, and that did, along with other Brazilian co-authors, did a couple of chapters in this book on Brazil. And it is a very sad case. It seems to underline what Jack Snyder was telling us about once you hit 25% of US GDP per capita, you can get stuck in the mud. And on the surface, that seems to me, anyway, for Fernando to help explain a little bit of what is going on. But certainly Brazil is no longer projecting the soft power that it once hoped to. Is that correct, Fernando? Let's turn it over to you now to hear your views on what's going on here in Brazil. What has been going on in Brazil?
Yes.
Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation, and thanks, Thomas, for the idea and initiative of bringing this group together. I hope we can continue discussing about this. I think it's more relevant than ever. And thanks always.
Volume 2.
And thanks, Professor Victoria and Burcu, Professor Burcu too. But also like to thank Professor John Tible for inviting me to be part of this group initially, and for giving me the honor to collaborate with him in this chapter. Well, it's great to come after Dilek, because in our chapter we work with the following question: is it possible to have a successful soft power strategy without having the hard power backup, right? So we brought back the notion of the dependency theory to think of the limitations and challenges of soft power in peripheral countries as Brazil. And for that, we used the case of Brazil during Lula's years, a time when the country seemed to be solving, at least in part, its huge social and economic inequalities internally, and at the same time advocated for a diplomacy that brought important elements of the Brazilian diplomatic tradition as peaceful, pragmatic, with partnership, multilateral-based actions, with strong diplomatic institutions and stronger presidential participation, and with intentions of becoming a leader for the South American social, cultural, and economic integration, and searching also for political solidarity and horizontal South-South partnerships with the global South, right? So Africa, Middle East, and Asia, but combining in one hand technical cooperation in fields as social inclusion, in programs as zero hunger or environmental agenda with concrete global goals, and diversified partnerships, but at the same time with an aggressive commercial agenda, with the expansion of so-called the Brazilian champions, the more competitive Brazilian companies in the global south. So what we saw was that Lula's attempts of implementing its ambitious soft power strategy with that assertive foreign policy advocated by Minister Celso Amorim that participated at our São Paulo seminar in 2017. This assertive foreign policy suffered from what we called at the time the illiberal clouds that also came with some choices of this Lula diplomacy package. Hard power, geopolitical interests with the disputes for the then newly discovered public-owned Brazilian oil, the pre-sal, and also economic pressures suffered from the spread of Brazilian corporations in the global south, as the civil engineering companies in Latin America and Africa that generated a series of corruption scandals prosecuted by international judicial task forces, also with the participation of US Justice Department, but focused mainly on the global south and also inside Brazil at the Brazilian companies and politicians. Added to that, a strong communication campaign with the traditional media, but internet and also WhatsApp, but added the internal political pressure of far-right movements and also, as Jack mentioned, weakened institutions. All this undermined this political project of making Brazil soft power leadership on the global south. And I think important to highlight that we wrote this chapter in 2017, a moment where former President Lula and its party, the Workers' Party of Brazil, were being judged for an infinite list of corruption charges. And just after President Dilma of the same party was impeached. But I think we are very happy that the chapter is still valid, and some of the things we were pointing out were confirmed later as biased Judge Sérgio Moro, that was later indicated as Minister of Justice at the Bolsonaro government after 2019. I believe, and I think Professor Tible agrees with me, that these forces and those illiberal clouds are present more than ever in Brazil at Bolsonaro's presidency. And we are still facing these struggles for a more democratic, peaceful, liberal, equal Brazilian society, and also in its diplomatic policy, with all its complexities and antagonisms. And I think this will continue on the next years. Thank you so much. I think that's
Thank you, Fernando. That was a great living in Brazil. I know how complicated the situation is. So to review it as you did in 5 minutes is no small achievement. Lula, as Jack and we both alluded to, is a candidate for president again. Current President Bolsonaro has definitely turned away from a South-South diplomacy, which is the thrust of soft power in Brazil, and in fact courted and was one of the leading global figures closest to former President Trump. So thank you so much for the always fascinating Brazilian case. Zhongying Pang, we turn to you for the very critically important case of China. Hear your views on soft power, where it stands. I'm tempted to remind you that Jack Snyder has told us that soft power seems to be plummeting in China. But is that, I'm not wondering whether that seems to be still the case in your view. But in any case, Zhongying, thank you very much, especially being so late at night in China. Thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me. And thank you very much for including me, my chapter. My topic is about China's soft power. And I have enjoyed this morning on this evening's discussions, colleagues, and after 2 years, more than 2 years pandemic, and after the war in Central and Eastern Europe, the so-called Eastern Europe, actually Ukraine is located in the center of Europe. And after such a big event, And thanks for the organizers, the editors, and Professor Victoria de Grazia. Thank you very much for your leadership and to organize the book. I think, and let me think about, let me offer some thoughts and now. And you know, the book, this is a great book. This is a innovative book. This is the first book and to conduct a comparative soft power on comparative history of soft power in the world, in today's globalized world. So, but I very much hope and you know, and we continue, or others continue the field of comparative soft power. So, and I worry, you know, I very much worry about the future of this field and created by the two editors, by the team, and by the chapter authors. And you know, this is my first suggestion, and let us think about no, this task and for the future. And after 33 decades, soft power, the globalization of soft power in the world, you know, and so the keyword, you know, the first keyword is comparative. The second keyword is internationalism. International, this is for our Chinese, you know, we in China, and so familiar with the term internationalism. This is a Soviet Union concept. This is a very old concept. And I try to persuade myself, and you, the editors, maybe also the publisher, maybe use internationalism to avoid globalism, because globalism, you know, President Donald Trump and his colleagues and very much opposed globalism, you know. So I know little about this because in the past 5 years, I visited the United States very little, only before the pre-pandemic. Before the pandemic, I saw Victoria and Burcu in Columbia University campus in 2019, you know, and thank you very much for your coffee. And you know, the internationalism and how to compare different soft power and how to see relationships, complex relations between China and United States, between or more, you know, countries, including Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, Russia, even Russia, and Professor Snyder, and your comment about Russia's soft power, I very much agree. I very much agree now, and yeah, and tonight, and for me. So the relationship between China and the United States, for example, soft power-based relationship. So my third keyword is China. My chapter and invited by you and tried to write all China's soft power. And I see China's soft, in my book chapter, I see China's soft power development and includes 3 stages. The first in 1990s, you know, and China introduced the soft power from the United States, and China enjoyed an engagement relationship with the United States. And the second stage is the first 10 years in the new century, 21st century. You know, this is a transition period. The last stage now changed a lot. And Professor Snyder just mentioned and the case of China's soft power. And now after the pandemic, after the war, and I believe China's soft power may be, so difficult to say, and maybe, and into a new era. This is the new era. This is China's political, slogan, and new era. And for example, the BRICS, even the BRICS, BRICS, our China model, and the China model dealing with the pandemic, and now, export China model or not export China model. So, and let me just mention these three keywords. The first is the comparative soft power and how to continue, how to sustain the research globally. The second is about internationalism. My suggestion is, the not use the internationalism, but let globalism come back. The last is China's case. It's too complex, to analyze the case of China's soft power. I think, and the quite different, and between China's soft power in the first 10 years, in 1990s, and this 10 years from 2012 or from 2030 to now. Let me stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, John Ying, for those three words that help us to understand a little bit of the complexity of your analysis and of the underlying situation in China. That's terrific. We went beyond where the formal presentation that ends. I hope no one thought of it as too formal. I didn't, but the presentation part would be over. I'd like if the authors can stick with us for another 15 minutes or so. If they have to leave, we'll understand, but if they can stick with us and the audience can stick with us, we'll handle a few of the questions that are in the Q&A. I'd like to do my job as the moderator, though, at this point, Malu, to ask you to put up the wonderful book on the screen for just a second, and then you can take it down, but just to show everybody what we're talking about. A book on soft power internationalism by edited by Burcu Baykurt and Vicky de Grazia. That is how one can order it. If you scroll down a bit there, Malu, you'll see that you can order it in ebook or in hard copy. So that's a wonderful book. It came out in May 2021. We're already talking issue maybe judged from our conversation about volume 2, Vicky. So maybe that'll be somehow you put that on your research agenda. And thank you all very much for contributing to this book. So with that, Malu, you can take that off, please, the screen, and we'll go back to the full screen with our authors here. If you can stay with us, there are a few questions, Vicky. Maybe I'll ask you and Jack maybe to take the lead in looking at the few questions that we do have in the Q&A now. And I've got a few others that I'd like to add in, but only if time permits. Vicky, can you see in the Q&A and respond to a couple of those questions that are there?
See, there is a very interesting question from Sean Lee. To what extent is the changing global order a result of the gradual reconciliation of knowledge gaps between cultures? So the way I understand your question does, in some sense, regard points that Burcu Baykurt was making. That is that the sort of the incentive, if you want, and the resource toward trying to use more persuasive means were created by the structures, the institutions that in some sense are a result of new technologies and also the new politics that could be engendered out of using those technologies. One thinks of communications. One thinks of the communication power that could come when you put your label on the resources, let's say like the pharmaceuticals that were being traded and provided as well between Brazil and Africa and areas where the Brazilians felt like they had a lot of power. So they were part around corporations, but they were also as coming to the kind of aid and a kind of South-South relationship. So economic and then given ideology, but made possible by much greater mobility, much more contact, which then of course had all sorts of relationships. So in that sense, I think your question in part can be answered by the fact that this really exists. And in that sense, I perhaps differ from Professor Snyder here, that you could say, hey, now we go swing back and forth, more war, less war. The fact remains that no matter what, U.S. leadership, let's say, with respect to the reappearance of these basically European democratic nation states opposing the hard power, the brutal war making in the Ukraine on the part of Russia, there is still a large world out of there which sees things very differently. In that, comes in clearly China and Chinese policymakers. China also, the opinion structures are very, very different. In the case of India, in fact, what comes out is almost like we're going back to the 1950s, which was a very interesting open period where there's an enormous bandung with respect to what can be regarded as like a European, intra-European, or some sort of particularity, which doesn't regard the other kinds of wars which have been waged by the West, so-called United States. So just to get back to answer to yours, that we're talking about a resource, a transformation, which even if we go toward more hard, the soft project is failed, let's say, doesn't in any way change the fact that this is an enormous resources which can be available. And I agree with Jack Snyder here for awfulness, for stirring up all kinds of muck, goodness knows, for realigning, as well as for perhaps reinstating politics, depending on that, a more democratic order, a more egalitarian order, an order which gives more voice to nations which have been excluded or been voiceless.
Thank you so much, Vicky. Rashan Yan Yang has asked a number of questions. We're not going to have time to get into them all, but one of them, maybe Jack, maybe turn to you for just a brief moment, and picking up on remarks from Zhong Ying about China's soft power. I mean, I caught that as a little bit of a conflict there, that you're feeling you kind of lumped in. I can understand U.S. soft power in Brazil, Turkey. I could understand those cases, but somehow the narrative.
You go first.
The narrative is that China comes out ahead in this.
Let me just quickly respond to the question by
Yang Yang. Yes.
Yeah, Yang Yang. And I think both sides, and the reason, to to the collapse, so-called, and I use your argument, your point, and the collapse of China's soft power. I don't think there is a collapse of China's soft power, and if so, and both sides, the reasons are from both sides, the West and the China, or China and the West. But I think and China itself, ourselves, and conduct, so-called conduct the policy shift and the so-called many shifts, and from the old ones to the new ones, and to the so-called the 新兴国际关系. So, and the Deng Xiaoping's doctrine is about never export political things, political ideologies, never conducted in international intervention. So, but China now, China's foreign policy has shifted a lot, and China now began to export, including China model. So, so I think that both sides, we think about, and China's old reason is the main.
Thank you. Jack, maybe a quick comment from you on response around that, further thoughts on the the Chinese case?
Yeah, I think that China's soft power was riding high when China's foreign policy line was peaceful rise, and where the rhetoric and much of the behavior was to become a member of international institutions like the WTO and the test ban treaty. And in that context, China had a good image and soft power. But in the last 10 years, the tenor of Chinese domestic and foreign policy has changed substantially, at least in the eyes of many people in the world, and that this has redounded to the detriment of China's soft power. It's made China look like a threatening, unreliable international partner. Now, there is in the American-China scholarly community some pushback against that characterization. Ian Johnston has written articles about, how new and how assertive is the new assertiveness of Chinese foreign policy. That's the title of one of his widely read articles. However, I think Ian Johnston is, fighting a defensive battle on those claims.
Thank you so much, Jack. And I'm not being very faithful to my moderator duties. I think he's gone a little bit more, but I'm just maybe final 5 minutes. I'd like to hear briefly from the other participants, and excuse me as an American being somewhat maybe provincial in asking this question, but the US soft power, we have the idea that the US is uniting the global democracies in this battle with Russia over Ukraine, but how is US soft power seen? If you could just answer the question briefly. Fernando, maybe start with you and then go to you, Dilek, when we haven't heard from yet. US soft power seen, perceived in the rest of the world. Is it a matter like Vicky de Grazia tells us, the US kind of undermined its own soft power by too much militarization, never abandoning militarization? How do you think, from the point of view of Brazil, Fernando, and Turkey, Dilek, how do you think about US soft power? Is it coming back or is it in terminal decline? Fernando, can I
Well,
pick you with that one?
no, it's not an easy question, but I believe US as Brazil recently with Bolsonaro, and US with the Trump government, they suffered a small decline in its soft power, but and I think also as everyone said a little bit, the use of military to solve problems internationally, I think this goes against the US soft power, and so there's a contradiction, I believe, in the discourse and in the actions of recent actions of United States. But it's interesting to think of the soft power currently after Trump. I think it's like Brazil, like I mentioned, that we're gonna face a lot of contradictions in the following years. I believe US is facing now, and will take some time to be free of this illiberal sometimes attitudes.
Thank you, Fernando. Dilek, and then I'll turn to you, Burcu, for a final comment today. But Dilek, would you like to take on my?
Well, I mean, there's always, as Vicky, argues, there's always this hegemonic connotations in a way, in the definition and also in the practice of soft power, by the United States. It's not only now, Well, in the case, if we can take the case of Ukraine, for example, it's interesting to read the articles and listen to talks of by Mearsheimer, you know, how, you know, this, how not, of course, Russia here is the aggressor power, but on the other hand, how, you know, this rivalry and you know, the conditions created by the Western Bloc, you know, led to the current situation. It's interesting, I think. I mean, to see how always hard power goes hand in hand with the soft power concerning the United States policies.
And the balance is a difficult one to strike. Burcu, can I turn to you for a final word? Anything you'd like to add? Maybe particularly your work on, we've mentioned the weaponization of the internet, which your chapter focuses on, but any just kind of a concluding retrospect on today's discussion or other issues you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, sure, thank you. I think one of the things we sort of tried to say it towards the end of the book, at least in the introduction, was to sort of leave it open what was going to happen after the 2015 period. And a lot has happened since then, even when we were like working on this book, like editing and going through the page proofs and everything. But I don't know how Vicky thinks about this, but I think we were right in saying that after sort of post-Cold War, there was a brief moment of, you know, look of a stability of some kind, even though there were values being sort of contested and clashed, like soft power internationalism showed us a possibility of what a more multilateral world might look like, and you know, didn't come to full fruition. But I think the sort of instability continues. I don't see much hope for soft power internationalism moving forward, at least as it stands right now, especially from the perspective of the internet, right? Like no one's as optimistic about the internet as they were even like 5 years ago. So in that sense, it doesn't look like soft power will continue to dominate. I mean, it will stay on as a concept, but may not dominate the toolkits of foreign policy professionals. So I personally feel confident about our conclusion in that sense. But it was important to document what that looks like for those like 2-3 decades. So thank you.
Thank you, Burcu. I did say we finished with Burcu, and maybe I'll stick to that. But Vicky, no, by all rights, but maybe you could give the final comment, and we'll close after you do so. Vicky, just to thank you again for the work you've done to put this. Everybody recognizing putting this all together and making it happen. Final valedictory comment from you would be great.
It truly is that. I just want to thank all of you for this creativity ongoing, and to thank you, Thomas, for hosting this and for enabling a kind of conversation that we hope will we'll be able to have. It really has been enormously instructive in that constant process of deprovincializing, which all great powers need. Great powers, big and small.
Thank you, Vicky, for all of that. Thanks again to the authors, to the editors, to my colleagues and around the Columbia Global Center Network, especially in Beijing. It's very late for them at night, so they're going to be listening to a lot of this on recording. And my colleagues as well in Istanbul. And it's been a pleasure to collaborate with you all. Congratulations again. For those of you who stayed with us, and a good number of you have, buy the book. And we'll see you again, hopefully in another seminar a little bit down the road. So have a wonderful rest of your day, everyone, and thanks again.